The wind whispered across the endless plains, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and distant campfires. The sun was just beginning to sink behind the jagged ridges, casting long, golden shadows over the ranch. A lone rider stirred up dust on the horizon, moving steadily toward the weathered barn that had seen more storms than most towns. He rode with a quiet purpose, the leather of his saddle creaking under the weight of a man who carried more than just his own burdens. This was a man who knew the land better than he knew any other soul, a man whose hands had tamed wild horses and mended fences through decades of sweat and stubborn pride. He was the kind of rancher who spoke in measured words, if at all, and whose eyes held secrets he would never tell. Then she appeared. She came down the dusty trail like a summer breeze that no one could ignore, her boots kicking up small clouds of dirt with each step. She was a newcomer to this wide-open land, a woman whose spirit seemed as untamed as the horses grazing near the fence. Her hair caught the last rays of sunlight, golden and wild, and her eyes held a mixture of curiosity and challenge. Even from a distance, it was easy to see that she was different from the others who had wandered through the ranch over the years, different in the way she carried herself, in the way she laughed, despite the hardships of the plains. When she reached the edge of the corral, the rancher's gaze shifted away, just for a moment, as if looking directly at her stirred something he could not face. He was a man who had built walls around his heart higher than the fences he maintained. And yet, here she was, a living question demanding answers he did not want to give. The air between them seemed to hum with tension, a charged quiet that could either break or bind. "What happens if I fall for you?" she asked, her voice soft but clear, carrying across the empty space between them. It wasn't a teasing question, it wasn't a challenge meant to provoke. It was a question that hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Her gaze searched his, daring him to reveal something, anything about the man he had kept hidden for so long. He looked away. His jaw tightened, and for the first time in many years, the silence of the ranch felt heavy, almost unbearable. That simple question had stirred memories he had buried, regrets he had locked away with the same care he used to store his tools and rope. There were promises he had made and broken, loves he had let slip through his fingers, and dangers he had faced alone. He had survived them all, yes, but surviving had come at a cost, one he wasn't sure he could risk paying again. She stepped closer, boots crunching over the rough ground. There was a courage about her that matched the wildness of the land. She did not flinch when he shifted uncomfortably or when his eyes darted toward the horizon as if the wind itself might carry him away. She waited. The patience in her stance was not passive. It was a quiet assertion that she belonged here just as much as he did, even if he refused to see it yet. The rancher finally spoke, his voice low and rough, shaped by years of shouting over the wind and the hooves of restless cattle. "You don't know what you're asking," he said, almost as if warning himself as much as her. He ran a hand across his weathered face, the lines deepening in the fading light. "This land, this life, it doesn't make room for hearts that can't handle the storms." She tilted her head, studying him like one studies a horse you're trying to understand, feeling the tension that lay beneath his words. "Maybe I can handle it," she said, and there was no bravado in her tone, just honesty. And that honesty unsettled him more than any gunfight or stampede ever had. Around them, the ranch seemed to hold its breath. The horses raised their heads, ears twitching as if sensing the storm brewing between the two. The barn doors creaked in the wind, the fences groaned, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, slicing through the silence. All the signs of the land pointed to one truth: change was coming. But change, the rancher knew, was a double-edged sword. It could bring hope or it could bring loss. And he had long since learned that hope could be a dangerous companion. Her presence brought back the memories he had tried to forget, the laughter of someone who had once made him believe in something he no longer allowed himself to feel, the warmth of trust that had been shattered by betrayal, the ache of love lost to circumstances he could not control. He had buried it all under years of hard work and long nights on the plains. And yet here she was, stirring those embers as though she had a map to the places he thought were unreachable. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples. Shadows stretched long and lean across the dirt paths, and the rancher felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. He could sense that if he didn't truly answer her, he might lose something more than just a passing feeling. Something in him wanted to tell her everything, to let the walls crumble and the past speak its truth. But fear held him back. Fear of opening himself to heartbreak again. Fear of letting someone in only to have them swept away by the unforgiving plains of life he had learned to navigate alone. She didn't ask again. She didn't need to. The silence between them said enough, and still she waited. Her eyes softened, not with pity, but with understanding, as if she already knew the battles he fought within himself. And for the first time in a long while, the rancher felt the stirrings of something dangerous, something he could not name but could feel gnawing at the edges of his carefully constructed solitude. A sudden gust of wind rattled the barn, and a loose tin roof panel clanged against the side, breaking the fragile tension for a moment. The horses stamped, and he flinched, more from nerves than fear of the animals. She reached out almost instinctively and rested her hand lightly on the rail separating them. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. It wasn't a promise. It was a statement, a declaration of patience and strength that made him look away once more, his throat tight with emotion he refused to let surface. The night was coming, and the first stars began to prick the sky with pale light. The ranch felt different in that twilight hour, as though the world itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The rancher's heart raced, even as his mind tried to stay rational, to remind him why he had kept his distance from the rest of the world. But every time he glanced at her, he felt the walls around him quiver, threatening to fall. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that if they did, nothing would ever be the same again. She drew back slightly, giving him space but not retreating. Her gaze never left him, steady and unwavering. The tension between them was like the quiet before a storm, heavy and electric. One question, one simple question, had managed to unravel decades of restraint and caution, and he did not know if he could gather the strength to hold it all together once the truth of his heart started to show. The rancher finally lifted his eyes, meeting hers for a fleeting moment before looking away again, toward the distant hills where the shadows were deepening. His silence spoke volumes louder than words ever could. The air was thick with unspoken fears, desires, and possibilities, and the night seemed to stretch endlessly before them. Something unnameable was stirring in both of them, a force that could either bring them together or leave them stranded in the lonely expanse of the plains forever. The stars above blinked into existence one by one, indifferent to human hearts and earthly worries. And as the wind carried the distant cries of coyotes across the land, the rancher's mind raced with questions he wasn't ready to answer. Could he risk the pull of her presence? Could he let someone see the man he had hidden behind years of silence and solitude? Or would fear drive him further into the isolation he had always known? She waited, and in that quiet, suspended moment, the whole ranch seemed to lean in, listening for the first words that might set them both on a new path. But the rancher only looked away again, eyes clouded with fear, heart aching with longing. The plains were wide, the night was deep, and somewhere in that vast emptiness, a choice waited, one that could change everything or leave them both lost in the shadows of what might have been. And so the night held them in its hush, the question lingering between them like smoke in the air. She had asked, and he had looked away, and the tension between fear and desire stretched out, endless as the horizon, leaving the future uncertain and the heart unsettled. The rancher stood in the twilight, hands gripping the rail until his knuckles were white. He could hear the distant river rushing, a sound that usually calmed him, but tonight it seemed louder, urgent, almost warning him. He had lived on these plains for longer than most could remember, a solitary figure among rolling hills, dusty trails, and the occasional wandering traveler. People had tried to settle here before, but the land was unforgiving. Only those who understood its rhythm survived, and he had survived because he knew when to fight and when to bend with the wind. Yet, this new presence, the way she had asked that question, had unsettled him in a way no storm or cattle stampede ever had. The woman, standing by the fence, seemed almost untouchable, a wild spirit that the ranch had never known. He studied her more closely now, noticing the small details, the frayed edges of her jacket, the determination in the way she set her shoulders, the light in her eyes that refused to dim even in the fading sun. She was not like the others who had passed through this land, chasing temporary work or fleeting dreams. She belonged here in a way that unsettled him because he had spent years believing no one belonged with him, not really. He remembered when he had first taken over the ranch from his father. The work had been brutal and the winters harsher. Nights were long and lonely, filled with the creaks of the barn and the moans of the wind. He had learned to trust the land more than he trusted people. His father had been a stern man, proud and unyielding, who had taught him that attachments made men weak. Love had been something to respect from afar, not something to risk. That lesson had stuck. He had followed it like a compass, and it had kept him alive, kept the ranch thriving, but it had also left a hollow space in his chest that he didn't dare name. Her arrival reopened that space. The way she had spoken, the way her question had landed in his chest, like a sudden thunderclap, made him realize how long it had been since anyone had looked at him as if he mattered beyond the work he did or the cattle he tended. And yet, fear had made him turn away, like he always did when something too real threatened to touch the fragile balance he had built. She, on the other hand, had not come here for the land alone. She carried a story of her own, one she had kept quiet until now. Her family had lost their farm in a distant valley after a flood had wiped out everything they owned. She had traveled across miles of open plains, through towns where strangers eyed her with suspicion, just to find a place where she could plant roots that wouldn't wash away. She knew what it meant to work with your hands until they bled, to face the harsh truths of nature and still rise each morning determined to keep going. Her resilience was what drew her to this ranch, but more than that, it was the quiet strength she sensed in the man who had looked away when she asked that question. There was a mystery in him she could not yet unravel, something that kept him distant, even when the world around them softened under the glow of the evening. She had heard rumors from travelers at the nearest town, tales of a rancher who had survived cattle rustlers, a winter storm that had killed half the herd, and a fire that had taken his barn long before she arrived. Yet no one spoke of his heart, and she could see the guarded sadness behind his sharp eyes. It made her want to reach him even more. As the night deepened, shadows stretched across the corral, and the rancher moved inside the barn, checking the horses and the equipment. He worked with the methodical care of a man who had known hard times and survived them. Every motion reminded him of the life he had chosen, a life of solitude, responsibility, and silent sacrifice. He could hear her footsteps as she walked the perimeter of the property, the soft crunch of dirt under boots that had grown accustomed to long travels. She was exploring, yes, but she was also watching him, learning the rhythm of his world, trying to understand the man behind the walls. He paused for a moment and glanced toward the horizon. The stars were beginning to pierce the dark sky, but a storm was coming. He could feel it in the wind. Clouds were gathering along the ridges, black and heavy. He did not like storms. They reminded him of nights when he had lost friends, when livestock had been lost to lightning strikes or floods, when decisions had to be made in moments of fear. And now, with her here, there was a storm he could not predict, a storm that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with what he refused to admit. The woman returned to the corral, leaning lightly against the fence, and he felt her presence even before he saw her. She was quiet, but it was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of patience, the kind that could wait for the truth to be revealed. "You work hard," she said softly, almost like a statement rather than a question. "Long days, longer nights. But there's a rhythm here, isn't there?" He grunted, not out of rudeness, but as an acknowledgement. There was a rhythm, yes, a rhythm he had lived by since boyhood, one that kept the ranch running and kept him alive. It was simple and unforgiving, like life itself. And yet her voice had a strange way of bending that rhythm, making him notice things he had stopped seeing. The way the stars reflected off the river, the way the wind shifted through the trees, the way silence could feel heavy with words unspoken. "You don't have to answer me," she continued, sensing his hesitation. "I know you're used to being alone. But I think sometimes we pretend we don't need anything else because it's safer than letting someone in, isn't it?" He turned his face away, staring at the dark horizon as if the answer might be written in the hills or hidden in the clouds. His chest tightened at the thought of letting anyone close again. Years of solitude had taught him to expect loss, betrayal, and hardship as constants. He had survived because he never let himself rely on anyone else. And yet her words, soft, gentle, and filled with understanding, threatened to undo all of that. The night grew colder. The wind carried the distant calls of animals, coyotes howling in the valleys, the rustle of deer moving through the brush. Somewhere in the shadows, a hawk circled, silent and patient. The rancher returned to his chores, checking the fences and the horses, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of her question, and the way it had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Could he allow someone to care for him? Could he risk the pull of a heart that might not be steady? She didn't leave. She stayed, leaning against the rail, watching him as he worked. She did not speak again, letting the quiet stretch between them like a rope that could pull them together or snap at any moment. And in that silence there was an unspoken understanding. She wanted to stay, and he wanted to push her away, both at the same time. Memories he had tried to bury rose unbidden. Nights spent alone in this very barn, tending to a sick horse, wondering if he would make it through the winter. Winters when snow had piled high against the fences and he had wondered if anyone would survive the cold. Moments when he had let someone in before, only to lose them to circumstance or tragedy. And now, standing here in the deepening night, he felt the weight of all that history pressing against him. But she was patient. She seemed to understand that some walls could not be broken with words alone. She waited, and her presence reminded him of things he had not thought of in years: laughter, warmth, and the possibility that someone might choose to stay even when the storms came. She was like the land itself, beautiful, wild, and dangerous, demanding respect but offering life if treated right. The rancher moved to the gate, shutting it carefully, then leaned against it, eyes fixed on the distant ridges. His thoughts were a tangle of fear, longing, and memories he could not untangle tonight. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that the storm she had brought with her, the storm of questions, of feelings, of possibilities, was only beginning. She finally spoke, her voice breaking the quiet again. "I don't want to scare you," she said softly. I just want to know if there's a chance." He looked away, jaw tight, heart racing. That one question had opened doors he had long kept locked. He could not answer her, not tonight, not yet. The night stretched endlessly, full of whispers, shadows, and the promise of change. Somewhere beyond the hills, the storm approached, and the rancher knew that the coming days would demand choices he had avoided for years. He could feel it in the wind, in the sky, in the way her eyes had held him captive with that single, impossible question. And though he tried to look away, he could not stop thinking about it. The night held them both in its hush, and the plains seemed to wait with them. The rancher's secret fears, her quiet persistence, and the land itself pressed in, heavy with anticipation. Whatever was coming, it would not wait. And the horizon, dark and endless, promised challenges neither of them could yet imagine. The next morning, the plains woke under a pale, uncertain light, the sun struggling to pierce the lingering clouds. The rancher was already up before dawn, moving through the stables with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this countless times. Each horse he checked, each feed bucket he lifted, reminded him of the responsibilities he could not shirk. The ranch demanded constant vigilance, and he clung to that rhythm as if it could shield him from the questions and feelings the woman had stirred the night before. She had stayed the night in the small guest room he rarely used, her presence both comforting and unnerving. He hadn't offered the invitation lightly, but something in her had insisted on staying, insisting on a quiet claim to a space that had long been his alone. When he had peeked in to check on her before retiring, she had been awake, staring out the window at the darkened ridges, as if listening to secrets carried on the wind. There had been no words exchanged, only a sense of understanding that neither of them could fully name. As he worked through the morning chores, he kept catching glimpses of her moving around the property feeding the chickens, carrying water to the garden, brushing down the horses with careful hands. She was competent, capable, and unafraid of the work that the land demanded. Yet every small action seemed to test him, as though she was measuring the space between them, and he was painfully aware that he could not keep her at arm's length for long. By mid-morning, the wind shifted, carrying a hint of an approaching storm. Clouds darkened along the horizon, and a low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. The rancher paused, hand on the gate, scanning the sky. Storms on the plains were dangerous. Cattle scattered, fences gave way, and the ground became a treacherous mixture of mud and water. He made a mental note to reinforce the weaker fences, but his mind kept drifting back to the question she had asked, the one that had pierced his defenses. Meanwhile, she wandered toward the far field, where a group of horses grazed near a bend in the river. She moved with ease, her eyes catching the smallest details, the broken fence post that leaned too far, the faint tracks of a coyote along the riverbank, the way a few horses huddled together as the wind picked up. Her curiosity was endless, and it was that same curiosity that drew her closer to the rancher. She wanted to know the story behind the man who had survived so much and yet carried a heaviness she could feel but could not explain. He watched her from the barn, tension knotting his shoulders. His instincts screamed at him to stay silent, to focus only on work, to let nothing break the careful solitude he had built over the years. But he also knew he could not ignore her, not fully. There was something persistent about her, a steady determination that mirrored the land itself, unyielding and patient. And with that determination came questions he could not answer without exposing the fears he had long buried. The storm came faster than expected. By late morning, the sky had darkened entirely, and the first heavy drops began to fall. The rancher moved quickly, securing gates, bringing the horses under shelter and checking the feed bins to ensure nothing would spoil. The woman followed, offering to help at every turn. He initially resisted, insisting it was dangerous, that the work required caution, that she should stay under cover. But she persisted, her movements confident, her hands steady. It was during this chaos that the first tension between them shifted into something more complex. As they worked side by side, the rancher noticed how her laughter carried even in the storm, light and unrestrained, breaking through the rigid walls he had maintained for so long. He found himself caught between irritation and admiration. She was a challenge to his solitude, a force he neither wanted nor dared to resist. And yet, with each glance she cast his way, he felt the pull of a connection he had spent years denying himself. But the storm also brought reminders of past dangers. The fence along the northern pasture had begun to give under the weight of the wind and rain, and a few of the horses had managed to slip through. The rancher cursed under his breath, rushing to prevent the animals from straying too far. The woman moved beside him, unflinching, helping him round the horses and repair the damaged fence. It was a trial of patience and skill, and in that trial the boundaries between them began to blur. Still, the question she had asked lingered in his mind, unresolved and heavy. He thought about the losses he had endured, friends he had buried too soon, lovers he had let slip away, trust he had given and never regained. The memories were sharp, cutting through the momentary calm of the storm. And as he worked, he realized that the woman's presence brought all those memories to the surface, challenging him to confront fears he had avoided for decades. There was another layer to the tension, one he could not voice. The ranch itself was on the edge of survival. Recent dry seasons had taken a toll on the land, and cattle prices had dipped low enough that a single bad month could mean ruin. The storm, though brief, was a reminder of how fragile their lives were, and how easily everything could shift. The rancher knew he could manage the land alone, but he also knew that the woman's presence added a new variable, a complication in a life already precarious. Yet in that same complication lay the potential for something he had never allowed himself to imagine: companionship. As the storm passed, leaving a wet and shimmering landscape behind, the two of them paused to catch their breath. The air smelled of damp earth and wildflowers, a scent that seemed almost unreal in its freshness. She leaned against the fence, watching the river swell with the rainwater, and he felt a pang of something he could not name. Protection, fear, longing, all tangled together in a knot that refused to loosen. Their conversation turned to stories of the land. She asked about the river, the hills, the challenges of maintaining the ranch. He answered cautiously, careful not to reveal too much of his own heart, yet the stories themselves carried truths he could not ignore. She listened intently, asking questions that went beyond mere curiosity, seeking understanding. And in that seeking, he sensed a patience that made the fear in his chest grow heavier, fear not just of loss, but of letting himself care. Later, as the sun broke through the clouds, she wandered toward the old barn again, where remnants of past storms lay scattered, broken boards, Rusted tools and the faded marks of repairs long since done? She traced her fingers along the weathered wood, feeling the history embedded in the place. He watched her, realizing that her fascination was not just with the land, but with the life he had built in spite of hardship. And that realization frightened him more than any storm, more than any struggle to survive on the plains. At that moment, the distant sound of a horse's gallop drew their attention. A rider appeared on the horizon, dust and rain kicking up behind him. He was a stranger, unknown to the rancher and the woman alike, and his approach carried an air of urgency that made the rancher tense. Could it be trouble? A visitor with bad intentions? Or perhaps someone from her past, drawn by the same curiosity or desperation that had brought her here? The arrival of the stranger added another layer to the tension between them. The woman stepped closer to the rancher instinctively, as if seeking reassurance, and he felt the walls around his heart strain against the pull of her presence. They both watched the rider, silent, waiting for the first sign of intent, knowing that this encounter could change everything. Even as the stranger drew nearer, the rancher's mind was torn between the immediate threat and the storm that raged inside him. The unresolved question she had asked, the one that had haunted him since their first meeting, continued to echo in his chest. Could he risk opening himself, even now, when danger might be on the horizon? Could he allow someone to see the man behind the ranch, the man who had survived loss after loss, without losing control again? The stranger stopped just beyond the corral, dismounting with a practiced ease that suggested experience and caution. He looked at the rancher and the woman, measuring them both in a way that made the air between them even heavier. Something unspoken passed between the three of them, a tension that carried history, suspicion, and the possibility of danger. And the rancher realized, with a tightening in his chest, that the choices he made in the next moments could ripple across his life in ways he could not yet foresee. The woman, sensing the shift in energy, stayed close, but her eyes were sharp, watching the stranger with the same curiosity and determination she had carried since she arrived. She was learning the land, the ranch, and the man beside her, and yet she was already preparing for the challenges the plains could throw at them. The storm had passed, but the tension remained. The rancher, the woman, and the stranger stood in the corral, the wet earth beneath their boots, the river swelling at their backs and the mountains looming in the distance. Every detail of the landscape felt alive with possibility and danger, and in that moment the rancher knew that the question she had asked, "What happens if she falls for him?" was only the beginning of a series of choices and conflicts that would test them both in ways they could not yet imagine. The plains held their breath, the wind shifted again, and the first shadows of evening stretched across the land. The unresolved tension between them simmered, tangled with the new threat at the gate, and the mysteries of the land, the past, and the heart that neither was willing to fully reveal. Whatever came next, the rancher knew it would demand courage, trust, and the willingness to face truths that had been avoided for far too long. And as the sun dipped lower behind the distant hills, the stage was set for the struggles, revelations, and choices that would define all their lives. The stranger's shadow stretched long over the corral as he finally stepped closer, dust and wet earth clinging to his boots. The rancher's hand hovered near his belt, instinctively ready, though he had no idea whether this man brought danger, news, or something worse. The woman stayed just behind him, her presence calm but steady, eyes locked on the newcomer with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Even standing in silence, the air between the three of them crackled with tension. The stranger cleared his throat, voice rough from travel, and spoke with a deliberate calm. "I'm looking for someone who knows these plains well. A man who runs a ranch north of the river." His eyes flicked between the rancher and the woman, a silent question in their depths. "I've heard he's not one to trust easily. That man wouldn't welcome strangers lightly." The rancher's jaw tightened, a reflex born of years of dealing with trouble without asking for help. "You've heard right," he said slowly, voice low, carrying the weight of authority earned through hardship. "I don't know who you are or why you're here, but this land doesn't have time for lies or tricks. Speak your business." The stranger nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and shifted his weight. "My business is complicated. It involves cattle that were stolen months ago, crossing through this area. And I was told correctly, it seems that you might know more than you admit. There's a man behind the theft, someone who's been moving stock across state lines, and you might be the only one who can stop him. A chill ran down the rancher's spine, not just because of the storm that had passed, but because the threat sounded personal. He had faced cattle rustlers before, people who believed the plains were lawless and unclaimed, but this sounded like someone with knowledge, someone dangerous. His mind raced, already calculating fences, herds, and what needed to be done to protect the land. Yet, even as he thought of practicalities, a deeper fear tugged at him, the fear that his careful world, the one he had built and protected for so long, was about to be invaded. The woman moved a step closer, placing a hand lightly on his arm. "You don't have to face it alone," she said quietly, though the words carried weight far beyond their gentle sound. He flinched at the touch, not because it was unwelcome, but because it stirred emotions he had long suppressed. He wanted to tell her to step back, to keep distance, but the thought of facing this threat alone felt heavier than admitting any vulnerability. The stranger gestured toward the northern ridge, where the fence had already shown signs of weakness after the storm. "If you want to protect your cattle, you'll need to move fast. The men who took them are clever, and they know this land better than most outsiders. They won't hesitate to strike if they think there's an opening." The rancher's gaze hardened. He had survived storms, fires, and winter freezes, but the threat of human cunning was different, more unpredictable. He could handle nature, but people who used the land against him required strategy, speed, and caution. He turned to the woman. "Stay close, don't go near the ridges. This isn't just work. It's dangerous." She nodded, eyes steady. "I'm not leaving," she said simply. "If you go, I go. We face it together." Her words were bold, and for a moment the rancher felt the old walls inside him start to crack. Fear mixed with something he could barely name, hope, maybe, or the possibility that he didn't have to shoulder every burden alone. The three of them mounted horses, moving toward the northern ridge where the broken fence marked the first line of defense. The wind had picked up again, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the distant smoke of a fire, likely a signal, or perhaps a brush clearing gone wrong. Clouds scudded across the sky, and every step felt like the land itself was testing them, reminding them of its power and unpredictability. As they rode, the rancher's mind returned to his past. He remembered nights like this, when he had lost friends to rustlers or storms, when choices had to be made in moments of fear. The memory sharpened his focus, but also reminded him of why he had learned to trust no one fully. And yet, sitting beside him, the woman's presence was a quiet defiance of that rule. She made him feel the stirrings of a heart long buried, a heart that could still hope for connection despite all the danger. They reached the ridge just as the sun began to dip low behind the mountains, casting the land in shades of deep amber and shadow. The broken fence was worse than he had feared. Horses had begun to drift through the gaps, and he could see faint tracks leading toward a narrow canyon, a path perfect for ambush. His pulse quickened, every sense alert. "Look there," the stranger whispered, pointing to movement among the trees below. Figures slipped between shadows, cautious but determined, carrying ropes and tools. The rustlers were skilled, and they had knowledge of the terrain that made the rancher wary. He signaled to the woman to stay behind a boulder, out of sight, and then dismounted quietly, moving closer with the stranger by his side. The tension was almost unbearable. Every footstep, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig could reveal them. The rancher's mind raced through contingencies, traps to set, paths to block, ways to herd the horses back without alerting the thieves too soon. The storm earlier had softened the earth, making it harder to track their movements quietly. And yet, amidst all this danger, the presence of the woman behind him brought an unspoken reassurance. She had chosen to be part of this, despite knowing the risks, and that choice struck deeper than any strategy or plan could. Hours seemed to stretch as they watched, waited, and calculated. The rustlers moved in a pattern, herding the stolen cattle toward the canyon. The rancher's pulse throbbed in his temples, every instinct screaming at him to act, to strike, to reclaim what was his. The stranger whispered suggestions, strategies born from experience and necessity, and the rancher nodded, weaving them into his own understanding of the land. Suddenly a shout broke the tense silence. A horse reared, its panic echoing across the ridges. The rustlers froze, scanning the hills. The rancher felt his heart leap. They had been spotted. The moment of action had arrived. He signaled to the stranger, and together they moved swiftly, descending toward the canyon. The woman followed, heart pounding but steady, moving with a confidence she had shown since the storm began. She was more than just an observer. She was part of the plan, and the rancher realized that her courage and determination were as vital as any strategy. The adrenaline coursing through him was matched by a strange relief. This was a fight, yes, but one that he did not have to face entirely alone. As they approached, the rustlers began to scatter, startled by the sudden confrontation. The stolen cattle bolted, some heading toward safety, others in confusion. The rancher moved with precision, cutting off escape routes, guiding the horses back toward the ridge, while the stranger managed the rest. The chaos was immediate, violent, and exhilarating, and in the midst of it, the rancher could feel the land responding to him, the very plains becoming a tool and ally in his effort. At one point he glanced up at the woman who was rounding up a young mare that had broken away. Her focus was absolute, and yet in that moment she caught his eye, and for a fleeting second they shared a look that said more than words ever could. Fear, adrenaline, and unspoken feelings surged between them, but there was no time for hesitation. The land demanded attention, and the conflict demanded action. By the time the sun had almost disappeared behind the mountains, the immediate threat was contained. The rustlers had fled, some leaving tracks that promised pursuit, others disappearing into the vast openness of the plains. The cattle were mostly safe, though a few stragglers would need rounding up at first light. The rancher, chest heaving, hands scraped and tired, finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. The woman came to his side, offering a hand to steady herself as she brushed mud from her sleeves. "You're not as untouchable as you think," she said, a teasing smile breaking through her exhaustion. The rancher allowed himself the briefest hint of a smile in return, the tension in his chest loosening just slightly. But even as they stood there, surveying the plains and the safe cattle, both knew this was not the end. The rustlers had been clever, and the stranger had left warnings in his words and actions that promised further challenges. The storm had passed, but the horizon was still uncertain, the land still demanding vigilance, and the hearts of both rancher and woman still carrying questions unresolved. They were together, yes, but the path ahead was still filled with danger, mystery, and choices that could change everything. And for the first time the rancher felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, together, they could face it all. The plains stretched wide before them, wild and untamed, much like the emotions simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when the next challenge would force truth from silence. The plains were calm again, bathed in the soft light of dawn. The storm from the night before had passed completely, leaving the air fresh, the grass sparkling with dew, and the river flowing strong and clear. The rancher stood at the edge of the corral, hands resting lightly on the fence, watching the cattle graze peacefully. His chest felt lighter than it had in years. The immediate danger had passed, but it was more than just relief over the rustlers disappearing. It was a quiet satisfaction, a recognition that he had not faced the challenge alone. She emerged from the barn, brushing the last traces of mud from her sleeves, and offered a small smile. "Looks like the land survived us," she said softly, a playful glint in her eye. He shook his head, a slow, reluctant smile forming. "It didn't just survive us, it's stronger than either of us, but we made it through." The word "we" hung between them, heavier than any storm or struggle. He had spent decades believing that survival was a solitary endeavor, that attachments and trust were luxuries he could not afford. And yet, here she was, standing beside him, a reminder that partnership could be a strength rather than a weakness. He looked at her, really looked, and realized that the walls around his heart had begun to crumble in ways he hadn't expected. Together they walked along the fences, checking for damage from the storm and the night's chaos. The stranger had departed at first light, leaving only a note that the authorities had been notified and that the rustlers would likely be caught. The rancher knew better than to relax completely. Life on the plains was never without surprises, but the immediate threat had passed. The tension in the air had shifted from danger to relief, and in that space something new could grow. As they worked side by side, he began to share stories of the ranch's history, of past storms and winters, of successes and failures. She listened with patience, her eyes reflecting the sunlight and the depth of her understanding. It was not simply curiosity, it was a willingness to know him, to understand the choices he had made and the sacrifices he had endured. And he, in turn, found himself opening up in ways that had been impossible before, telling her not just the practical details of the land, but the memories that came with it, the ghosts of losses long past and the quiet moments of joy he had found in solitude. By midday, the cattle were rounded up, the fences reinforced, and the land had settled back into its usual rhythm. The rancher leaned against a post, wiping sweat from his brow, and for the first time allowed himself to feel something he had denied for so long: contentment, tempered by hope. He looked at her, noticing the way the sunlight highlighted her hair, the determination in her posture, and the warmth in her gaze. She had chosen to stay through storms, danger, and uncertainty, and he knew that she was not just a companion in work, but a companion in life. "You've changed this place?" he said quietly, more to himself than to her. She looked up, curious. "Me?" she asked. "Or just U.S.?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Both. You've reminded me that some things are worth trusting, worth protecting, and worth risking your heart for." Her smile widened, and she stepped closer. "I think you've reminded me too," she said. "The land is strong, yes, but it's the people who make it home." The rancher felt a warmth in his chest he hadn't realized he'd been missing, a sense of belonging that went beyond the work, beyond the solitude. It was the realization that life could be shared without losing oneself, that love did not have to be a weakness, but could be a strength that made even the harshest plains feel welcoming. As the sun moved higher, they rode the property together, checking the distant pastures, guiding the remaining cattle back into safety and reinforcing the old gates and fences. Their laughter began to fill the open air, a sound that had been absent from the ranch for too long. The woman was no longer a visitor or an observer, she was a partner, equal in skill, courage, and determination. Together they moved with the rhythm of the land, understanding that the plains demanded teamwork, trust, and shared effort. Later, as evening approached, the rancher found himself sitting on the porch of the main house, looking out over the fields as the woman settled beside him. They didn't need words at first, simply sitting in companionable silence, the land stretching endlessly before them. The sky was a deep gold, fading into purple, and the stars began to prick the heavens with their gentle light. It was a perfect moment of peace, a calm after the storm, and the rancher felt the tension of years finally begin to lift. "I have to ask," she said quietly, turning toward him, "about that question I asked the first night." Her voice was tentative, careful. "What happens if I fall for you?" He took a deep breath, feeling the old fear rise for a moment, but it was tempered now by trust, courage, and something far stronger than he had expected. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not just curiosity, but love, patience, and unwavering belief in him. "Then we face it together," he said finally. His voice was low, steady, and filled with the weight of truth he had carried for so long. "The plains will test us, storms will come, and dangers will rise, but if we stand together, we can handle anything." Her eyes shone with relief and joy as she reached for his hand, holding it firmly, deliberately, a silent vow of partnership, trust, and hope. The rancher felt a sense of completeness he had never thought possible. The walls he had built around his heart had not fallen completely. They had transformed, becoming a space where love and resilience could coexist, strong and unyielding like the land itself. Over the following weeks, life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. The cattle thrived, the fences stood firm, and the land, which had once seemed so vast and indifferent, felt alive with possibility. Together, they worked side by side, sharing both labor and laughter, learning from each other and growing stronger as a team. The rancher taught her the intricacies of the land, the hidden water sources, and the careful attention each animal required, while she brought fresh ideas, perspective, and a vitality that breathed new energy into the ranch. Evenings were spent by the fire, sharing stories long held in silence, finding humor in mishaps, and slowly allowing their hearts to trust one another fully. The challenges of the past, the storms, the rustlers, the losses were still a part of their lives, but they no longer carried them alone. Together, they had built something that was not just a ranch, but a home. A place where courage met love, where resilience was strengthened by companionship, and where the open plains no longer felt lonely. One late afternoon, as they walked along the river, watching the reflection of the mountains in the rippling water, the rancher spoke softly. "I used to think I could face everything alone, that relying on anyone was a risk I couldn't afford, but now I see that some things are worth risking for you. This U.S.?" He gestured toward the land, the cattle, and the horizon. "It's more than survival. It's life, and it's better together." She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "And I think this land and you are worth every risk." The moment was simple, yet profound, a culmination of trust, patience, and courage. The plains stretched endlessly, golden and alive, bearing witness to the union of two hearts that had found strength in one another. That night, as the stars filled the sky and the wind carried the scents of grass and river, the rancher and the woman sat on the porch, hands intertwined, hearts aligned. The threats had passed, the dangers managed, and the unanswered questions had been faced with courage and honesty. The plains were still wild, storms would still come, but the lessons of trust, patience, and partnership had been learned, and the future felt wide open and full of promise. In the quiet of that night, the rancher finally allowed himself to feel fully alive. He realized that the land, which had taught him resilience, patience, and strength, had also taught him to love. And standing beside the woman who had chosen to stay, who had faced storms and danger by his side, he understood the truth that had eluded him for so long: no challenge, no loss, no storm could match the strength of two hearts united by trust, courage, and hope. The plains stretched endlessly, golden under the first light of dawn, and for the first time in years, the rancher looked at the horizon and smiled. Not with the caution of someone preparing for hardship, but with the quiet confidence of a man who knew that life, love, and land could all be faced together. And in that simple, human truth, the rancher and the woman found a home not just on the plains, but in each other.